Imagine this. You're standing in the cool marble corridors of a grand palace in ancient Macedonia. In front of you, one of the most unsettling wedding ceremonies in history is about to unfold. Through the palace's towering columns, you glimpse the courtyard below, where nobles gather, their voices rising in joy. They think they are celebrating her triumph. If only they knew. His smile is too sharp, his grip too firm. The ceremonial crown he placed upon her moments ago feels more like chains than a blessing. He has promised her protection, promised her sons will be recognized as rightful heirs to the throne he seized. The linen garments itch against your skin as you watch a woman, steady a golden crown on her head, an ornament that marks her as queen. Around her, the court celebrates. But inside, she is already plotting. 25 years in the brutal game of Hellenistic politics has taught her this. Survival demands far more than beauty or noble birth. Polion, hidden in the crowd. Unlike his younger brothers, he had refused to travel to Pella. He sensed the trap she, in her desperation, willingly walked into. Arsenia, daughter of the great commander Soterios, who helped carry Alexander the Great's body from Babylon and carved an empire from its ashes, has become what men always accused royal women of being, a pawn in the games of kings. Her fingers tremble not out of fear, but from a fury she must force down like bitter wine. This is Arsenia, one of the most formidable women of the ancient world, about to marry her half-brother, Tomas. They call him Stormburn for his ruthless ambition. He stands beside her now, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist. Tonight, Macedonia will celebrate its new queen, but she will lie beside a man who sees her only as a tool, her children as threats. But you can see it in his eyes. That same hunger that drove him to slaughter his rivals and claim the kingdom of Macedon. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden stories from history. And tell me, where are you listening from? It amazes me that these ancient echoes connect us across time and place-bound by our curiosity for the price of power and the women who paid it. What he truly desires isn't a wife, but the elimination of every threat. Like the gods they name, Arsenia and Tomas are siblings, forced into a divine parody of marriage. She whispered tales of goddesses and heroines into the girl's ears, but the reality outside the nursery was far more brutal. The nobles pretend not to see the revulsion in her eyes. Ships from India and Arabia clog the harbor, heavy with silk, spice, and ivory. And even now, she is weaving a web one that may save her. Her father, Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, had helped carry the conqueror's body back from Babylon. She watched rituals in ancient temple courts, saw priests reenact ceremonies that had endured for 3,000 years. Every day brought new questions about their right to rule. In the chaos that followed, he carved out his own domain, or doomed them all. Isis, mother of all. Osiris, ruler of the dead. Their love wasn't taboo. It was the foundation of life itself. This isn't the first time she's been traded like a coin for political gain. At just 15, her father gave her away to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Her 3 sons from a previous marriage are thorns in his path. And despite his honeyed words, the blood on his hands already speaks the truth. The priests begin their chant in ancient Greek, invoking Zeus and Hera to bless this union, a cruel irony. Now, at 40, she's currency once again. You watch as she raises the wine to her lips, its taste like ash. It demands patience, strategy, and the ruthless resolve to do whatever is necessary. As Tomas raises his cup, offering a toast to their blessed union, you catch sight of her eldest son. That decision may yet save his life. Hers, however, hangs by a thread. And the cruelest part? But they forget something vital. A pawn, when it reaches the other side of the board, becomes the most powerful piece. The ceremony ends with kisses laced in venom and promises as fragile as shattered clay. What he doesn't know is who he's truly married. The blood of conquerors flows through her veins. She has survived courts more dangerous than his. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten tale of power and peril beneath the shadow of ancient pyramids, Arsenia's story doesn't begin with love or even desire. It begins with the cold arithmetic of empire. Born around 316 BCE in the gleaming new city of Alexandros, she entered a world where noble blood was both a privilege and a prison. In the halls of the royal palace, young Arsenia would have quickly learned that her beauty was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. Her stepmother, Brunessa I, had risen from obscurity to queenship, using only charm and intellect. In the world of the Diadochi, the fractured kingdoms born from Alexander's death, daughters weren't just daughters. They were living treaties. Arsenia's childhood, Alexandria, buzzed with promise. The great library was rising, drawing scholars like moths to flame. But beneath the marble facades and elegant debate, the city pulsed with uncertainty. The royal house of Tullin was Greek in blood, ruling Egyptian soil Macedonians playing at pharaohs. Arsenia grew up bilingual. She spoke Greek in the palace and learned Egyptian from the servants who raised her. Even as a child, she understood that Egypt was not like the other Hellenistic realms. Here, the king wasn't just a man. He was divine. And in divine matters, marriage and bloodline had their own sacred rules. She heard the priests tell tales of Isis and Osiris, siblings and spouses, whose sacred union brought order to the universe. And perhaps, even then, Arsenia understood what the future would demand of her. To the native Egyptians, sibling marriage among the gods was not scandalous. It was sacred. But to the Greeks, it was an abomination that defied natural law. When Arsenia was just 15, her father made the decision that would shape the rest of her life. It was the year 300 BCE. The successors of Alexander the Great, known as the Diadochi, were still locked in fierce struggle over the fragments of his empire. The solution was political and coldly efficient: marriage. Lysandros, the aging king of Thrace, needed allies to defend his position, and Ptolemy, Arsenia's father, needed to secure his eastern frontier. His body bore the scars of 100 campaigns, including one from a lion that earned him his fearsome nickname. Lysandros was 55 battle-hardened general who had fought beside Alexander from the Danube to the Indus. Nobles from across the Hellenistic world gathered, their voices echoing under high arches. Arsenia stood at the center, cloaked in Egyptian linen dyed with rare Tyrian purple. Her hair was crowned with a jeweled diadem that glinted like fire. Poets sang verses comparing her to Helen of Troy and Penelope the Faithful. To the north, wild Thracian tribes pushed against his borders, hungry for loot. To the east, a Seleucid empire stretched across half the known world, with King Seleucus always testing for weakness. And to the south, rival successors watched with sharp eyes for the first sign of instability. She was a mother and potentially the matriarch of a new dynasty. Musicians played lyres and flutes. Dancers performed for nobles from across the empire. It demanded vigilance, calculation, and absolute awareness of the shifting tides of power. Every whispered joke or missed toast could signal an alliance or a betrayal. But beneath the splendor, a grim truth simmered. Arsenia was no longer simply a daughter of Egypt, or one of the young princes, born of an Egyptian princess tied by blood to the legacy of Alexander. She was now queen of Thrace and a pawn in the deadly chessboard of post-Alexandrian politics. Their wedding took place in Sardis, once a Persian capital, a city steeped in ancient splendor. With each birth, her political capital grew. Each child was both a shield and a sword, a claim to succession and a potential liability. Her eyes shone with intelligence, tempered by a carefully hidden fear. She sponsored philosophers and poets, creating an intellectual circle that celebrated her refinement and wisdom. She participated in public rituals, honoring the gods of Thrace, while still maintaining her Egyptian spiritual identity. And as Arsenia's sons began to grow from babies into boys, court whispers turned to open speculation. Who would inherit the throne? Others saw opportunity in the rise of Arsenia's children. To young Arsenia, he must have seemed like a creature from myth equal parts, terrifying and regal. She was not just a queen, she was a foreign queen, and that made her loyalty suspect. Her children were seen not as heirs, but as potential usurpers. Picture the scene. A grand hall lit by flickering oil lamps, its walls gilded with gold leaf. He spoke the ancient Greek vows with ceremonial grace, but behind his eyes, the calculation never stopped. This was no romantic union. It was a pact, an alliance carved from flesh and sealed in blood. She was beautiful in the way that teenage girls are radiant with promise, fragile beneath the surface. Lysandros placed the ring on her finger with the same hands that had once steadied Alexander's stirrup. As they drank the ritual wine, she tasted her future, bitter, intoxicating, and inescapable. The wedding feast lasted for 3 days. Lysandros had ruled for decades, but his position was far from secure. In this treacherous landscape, Arsenia learned her first great lesson. Survival was never guaranteed. It required more than beauty or lineage. She observed her husband's courtiers like a hawk, learning to read every glance, every pause in conversation. Within a year, she gave birth to a son Tamian born in 299 BCE. His arrival changed everything. She was now more than a bride. 2 more sons followed quickly. Lycian in 297 BCE and Phalippos in 294 BCE. But there was one obstacle. Lysandros already had a grown son, Agathon born of a previous marriage. Agathon, the elder son of noble but non-royal blood, the nobility divided. Some backed Agathon, wary of foreign influence. Meanwhile, Arsenia found herself caught in the middle of an increasingly dangerous power struggle. The very court that once celebrated her now watched her with suspicion. Every word she spoke was dissected, every gesture scrutinized for hidden meaning. The weight of expectation was suffocating. Imagine being in your early 20s, living far from your homeland, responsible for 3 small children, surrounded by rivals who smiled politely at court and whispered poison in private. Failure would mean more than personal disgrace. It would mean the weakening of the Ptolemaic dynasty itself, her father's great legacy. So, Arsenia adapted. She began to cultivate a loyal circle of ladies-in-waiting, securing their allegiance with gifts of Egyptian gold. Slowly, methodically, she built her own base of influence, one that did not rely on her husband's favor. And then, in the year 283 BCE, everything changed. By the time Arsinoe's eldest son, Ptolemaios, turned 16, the question of succession could no longer be ignored. By Greek custom, he was now considered a man old enough to be a prince in name, and perhaps more. His father, Lysimachus, was 73. His hair was white as snow, his steps no longer steady. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades longer than Alexander. The great had lived, and it showed in every furrow of his weathered face. But his mind remained sharp. He saw clearly the impossible decision before him. Support his firstborn son, Agathocles, and risk severing his alliance with Egypt. Others insisted she merely laid out the political realities cold, undeniable, and brutal. The truth, as always in these tangled dynasties, lies somewhere in between. But in the world of Hellenistic power, appearance was often more important than proof. Support the younger sons of Arsinoe, and he risked civil war among his oldest and most loyal followers. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. His death sent a clear, terrifying message. Arsinoe's sons were now the future of Thrace, and those who opposed them would not be tolerated. Some claimed Arsinoe bewitched her husband, seducing him into eliminating the rival heir. What we do know is this. In 283 BCE, Agathocles was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence was tenuous at best, a few intercepted letters, some hushed meetings, the words of witnesses whose honesty remained suspect. From the east, he moved his armies against Lysimachus' Anatolian holdings. In the north, Thracian tribes grew bolder. Along the coast, pirates raided with impunity. The kingdom was unraveling from every direction. Despite his age, Lysimachus rode out to battle one last time. Two men in their 70s, relics of a vanished age, met at Caropedium in what would be the last great clash of Alexander as heirs. The old king fell in battle, his body pierced by a dozen spears. Within days, Agathocles was executed, on his father's orders. The court was stunned. Agathocles had been a seasoned commander, popular among the nobility. He had marched in battle beside his father. The cities that once cheered her entry now welcomed her enemies. Her allies were being hunted, executed, enslaved, and she had nowhere left to turn. But this brutal victory came at a terrible cost. The kingdom split. The old guard nobles who had served Lysimachus since the beginning turned bitter. They saw Arsinoe not as a queen, but as a foreign enchantress, a second Medea, willing to burn down a dynasty to secure her children's place. His soldiers scoured the countryside, purging the old regime. Arsinoe's name was now synonymous with treachery in the streets she once ruled. The whispers thickened like poison in the air. Seleucus had promised to restore him to power, to place him on the throne of Macedon as a client king. With no army to protect them, no allies to defend their claim, and an empire dissolving around her. Outside the kingdom, the vultures began to circle. Seleucus I, one of Alexander's last surviving generals, sensed the weakness. And then, in 281 BCE, came the final blow. He murdered his host and benefactor in cold blood, seizing the Seleucid army and proclaiming himself king of Macedon. She packed what treasure she could carry. She prepared to run. The queen riding beside her three sons, Ptolemaeus, now 17, Lysimachus 15, Philippos 12. Once princes, they were now fugitives. Their silks traded for rough cloaks. Behind them, Thrace burned. Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a massive army, claiming to avenge Agathocles. The result was disaster. Lysimachus' army, fractured by years of infighting and distrust, broke under the Seleucid assault. And just like that, the kingdom of Thrace, built over a lifetime, collapsed like a house of sand. At 35, Arsinoe found herself in the most precarious position of her life. She was a widow, a mother of 3 sons. Seleucus was advancing on the capital. His vengeance was methodical. But Arsinoe had survived 2 decades of palace intrigue. She was not about to surrender. As word of her husband's death reached her, she acted swiftly. She gathered her loyalists. The woman who had once arrived at Sardis in a golden bridal litter now faced flight under the cover of night. Imagine it, a caravan winding through the dark, torches flickering, hooves muffled by sand. Seleucus had taken the capital. But the story was not yet over. Even as Arsinoe fled west, another drama was unfolding, one that would twist the knife in Seleucus's triumph. Her half-brother Ptolemy Serranus, son of her father by another wife, had been living in exile at the Seleucid court. But Serranus was ambitious, impatient, and utterly without conscience. Just as Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, Serranus struck. The conqueror was dead, and once again the tides of fate shifted. The last of Alexander the Great's original companions was dead, killed by a man young enough to be his grandson. The news reached Arsinoe as she sheltered in a coastal town along the Aegean. Her half-brother, the same man passed over in Egypt's succession, who had spent decades nursing resentment in foreign courts, was now king of Macedon. Ptolemy Serranus promised to recognize Arsinoe's sons as his heirs, to restore to them the kingdom their father had lost. He spoke of destiny, of shared bloodlines, and the idea that the Ptolemaic name should reign in Macedon, just as it did in Egypt. and he had sent her a marriage proposal. The offer arrived with a messenger cloaked in flattery and sweet words, speaking of reconciliation, of family unity, of healing old wounds. She knew how royal vows could dissolve the moment they became inconvenient. And yet, she also knew she had no choice. Arsinoe listened in silence, her face carved from stone. She sent her eldest son, Ptolemy, to the court of a distant ally. If disaster struck, at least one child might survive. Arsinoe stood beside her half-brother as priests intoned the sacred rites. In Egypt, such unions were not just acceptable, but sacred, seen as reflections of divine balance. To the Greeks, however, this marriage reeked not of destiny, but of desperation. He had not married Arsinoe for love, or even alliance, but to eliminate the threat her sons posed. It was the kind of hard wisdom only a mother could carry, born of grief, fear, and love. She was no longer a naive girl, but a woman of 40 who had seen firsthand what men would do for power. The boys were dragged from their beds and murdered as their mother watched. She knew marrying her half-brother was a risk, possibly a death sentence. But refusal meant permanent exile, a life spent drifting from court to court, watching her sons become dependents, forgotten footnotes to history. She had heard such promises before from Lysimachus, from courtiers, from generals. Her sons needed protection. She needed a throne from which to offer it. Accepting Charaonis's offer was the most difficult decision of her life. Even as her sons' bodies were removed, she was already plotting her escape, so she chose. Before departing for Macedon, Arsinoe made one final, painful decision. Now, watched by guards, surrounded by spies, Arsinoe began to plan her own survival. Even Ceraunus dared not violate such ground. The gods of Samothrace were older than kings. She had gambled everything on blood and family, and in return, she had witnessed betrayal at its most brutal. The wedding took place in Pella, the ancient capital where Alexander himself had once been raised. Disguised in coarse wool, her crown replaced by a simple headscarf, she slipped away from Pella. In her place, she left a decoy, a slave woman who resembled her well enough to delay the inevitable discovery. All knew they were part of a drama that would outlive them. The ceremony was lavish. Ceraunus spared no expense in projecting legitimacy and power. But beneath the golden robes, the music, the feasts lay cold political calculation. They were children of the same father, Ptolemy I, but different mothers, born of one man's many dynastic marriages. The wedding feast lasted 3 days. The honeymoon lasted less than one. On the very night of their union, Ceraunus revealed his true purpose. The betrayal came quickly and without mercy. Soldiers surrounded the palace chambers where her 2 younger sons, Lysimachus and Philip, aged 15 and 12, were sleeping. Their blood soaked the marble floors of the same palace where Alexander had once played. Arsinoe's screams echoed through the halls of Pella, a sound that would linger in memory for generations. But her grief was a luxury she could not afford. She had survived 2 decades of court intrigue. She would not let this betrayal destroy her. She remembered her father, Ptolemy I, and how he had escaped impossible situations by being quicker and colder than his enemies. Her escape would become legend. With the help of loyal servants and the invisible web of slaves and freedmen that stretched through every royal court, she disappeared into the night. The journey that followed was harrowing. Soldiers scoured the countryside, hunting for the queen who had humiliated their king. Arsinoe moved through the shadows, sheltered by sympathizers who risked their lives, some out of loyalty, others for gold. Her destination was the island of Samothrace. There, in ancient temples older than any city-state, the sacred mystery cults offered sanctuary to all who sought it. As her ship neared the rocky coast, Arsinoe must have felt the full weight of all she had lost. Her kingdom, her sons, her illusions. But she was still alive. and history had not yet written her final chapter. She had been married 3 times. She had borne 3 sons. She had ruled as queen over 2 kingdoms. Now she was a fugitive living on temple charity and the protection of sacred laws. 2 of her sons were dead, murdered by her own half-brother. The 3rd was in exile, his fate uncertain. But Arsinoe was not a woman broken by tragedy. Ptolemy II Philadelphus ruled from Alexandria, the very city where she was born, and the place where her exile had begun 4 decades earlier. She moved in disguise, sometimes as a merchant's wife, other times as a pious pilgrim in search of enlightenment. If she could reach him, if she could win his trust, she might yet survive. Even as she mourned her children, her mind was already turning toward her next move. Arsinoe is no longer the princess who had departed in a bridal litter. She was now a queen hardened by betrayal and driven by necessity. She still had one final card to play, one last chance to reclaim her legacy and secure her future. When she finally stepped ashore in Alexandria, her heart must have swelled with conflicted emotion, longing, dread, memory. This was home. If he were to set her aside and marry his sister, Arsinoe too, he would gain not just a queen, but a co-ruler, someone who truly understood the intricate power games of the Hellenistic world. Ptolemy II was 36, a thoughtful man shaped more by books than by battle. He had inherited a prosperous Egypt, with secure borders and gilded temples. But unlike their father, he was a cautious ruler and willing to gamble on ambition. Pharaohs had long wed their sisters, modeling themselves on the gods. No Greek ruler had ever dared to wed a full sister. Half-siblings, perhaps. Cousins, certainly. But this was crossing a line from which there was no return. He would become a pharaoh and truth heir, not just to Alexander, but to the gods of Egypt themselves. It was a masterstroke of symbolism, merging Greek ambition with Egyptian divinity. Isis and Osiris, divine siblings and rulers of the underworld, symbolized a cosmic balance. Such unions were believed to preserve divine order. And yet, it was also the city that had cast her out. Her youngest brother now sat on the throne of Egypt. She wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the same symbol that had adorned pharaohs since the days of Narmer. With that crown, she was no longer merely a sister or refugee. She was a seasoned political player, but also a rival with claims of her own. Negotiations were careful. Arsinoe asked for sanctuary, but not passivity. She had no intention of fading into quiet retirement. She had ruled, negotiated, survived. She would not be a decorative relic. But others saw it for what it was, a calculated bid for legitimacy, a political move cloaked in religious grandeur. In their place, incense smoke curling beneath lotus-painted ceilings, sacred chants in an ancient tongue, priests cloaked in linen white. It was Egypt's gods, not Greece's, who presided. No other Hellenistic house could claim such a link to the divine. The journey from Samothrace to Alexandria was perilous. Ptolemy Chirones's warships prowled the northern Aegean, and pirates haunted the southern seas. But Arsinoe had learned to adapt. Her famed beauty, once a tool of diplomacy, was now hidden beneath coarse garments and soot-darkened cheeks. There, in the great temple of Ptah, surrounded by towering columns and age-darkened statues, the rites were performed according to the oldest traditions. The royal palace, where she had once played as a girl, was now ruled by a brother she barely remembered. Their reunion was uneasy. Decades of separation had bred suspicion. Ptolemy, for his part, saw in her both an asset and a threat. Then came the solution, radical and brilliant. Ptolemy II was already married to Arsinoe Ai, a noble woman who had borne him children, but lacked the sharp instincts needed for court politics. The proposal was bold, but not unprecedented. In the traditions of ancient Egypt, sibling marriage was sacred. But the Ptolemies were Greeks, and to the Greek mind, sibling marriage was a horror, an offense against nature and morality. Ptolemy II knew this, And he did it anyway, because by marrying Arsinoe, he would cease to be a Greek king ruling an Egyptian land. The announcement of the engagement sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. Greek philosophers decried it as moral collapse. Statesmen whispered about dynastic decay. The wedding itself was a spectacle of ancient majesty. The ceremony took place not in Alexandria, but in Memphis, the old capital of the pharaohs. Gone were the hymns of Homer or the rituals of Olympia. Arsinoe, now 41, stood beside her brother, just 26, as the high priest anointed them both. She was again a queen, and more than that a goddess in the eyes of her people. Her brother stood before the gods and the people clad in the regalia of a true pharaoh. He bore the crook and flail, ancient emblems of shepherd and sovereign, symbols that had passed from myth into millennia of monarchy. The hymns sung that day were older than the temples themselves. Verses etched in time, once whispered over the construction of pyramids, now resurrected to sanctify a union meant to echo the cosmos. They did not sing of mortals, but of gods, of sky and earth united, of chaos subdued by order, of a marriage that turned man and woman into deities. On that day, Ptolemy and Arsinoe ceased to be merely siblings or sovereigns. They were reborn as Philadelphoi, sibling-loving gods, a name that would both scandalize and sanctify. The Greek elite of Alexandria were aghast, their sensibilities jarred by what they saw as incestuous spectacle. Rome advanced in the west, while Parthia threatened the eastern edge of the Seleucid realm. Arsinoe understood that divine legitimacy was a weapon as potent as any army, but they were also awed. Never before had they seen the full force of pharaonic ritual in motion, not diluted through Greek ceremony, but in its full native grandeur. They were heirs to both Alexander and the gods of old Memphis. Their authority was not just political, it was cosmic. They stood beside Isis and Osiris, or appeared as these gods themselves. They blessed harvests, judged mortals, maintained the sacred balance of the universe. On obelisks and temple walls, their divine forms received offerings and granted favor. The Ptolemies had long walked the line between two worlds. Arsinoe, now Arsinoe Philadelphus, became his consort, not just in title, but in power. She was no longer a queen in exile, or a widow of fallen kings. She was now a pharaoh's equal. Future Ptolemies would marry their sisters, not in lust, but in imitation. Her most famous successor, Cleopatra VII, would marry not one, but two of her brothers, invoking Arsinoe's divine precedent to challenge even Rome. She had turned incest into empire, suffering into sovereignty. She joined Ptolemy on royal tours, arbitrating disputes, smoothing tensions between Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Nubians alike. She had lost her youth to a joyless marriage, her children to a brother's sword, her homeland to political betrayal. She had fled across oceans, disguised as a merchant's wife, mourning the sons who would never grow old. She revived temples, sponsored scholars, and lent her prestige to Alexandria's museum and library, ensuring that Egypt remained the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. Once a girl offered in marriage to an aging king. Once a mother forced to watch her sons perish. She had seized what power she could and forged from it a legacy that would echo for centuries. Once a fugitive in a stolen ship, praying to gods she barely believed in. Now, for the first time, they stepped fully into Egypt. This union was not for procreation, but for apotheosis. Together, they had reshaped the Ptolemaic dynasty, elevating it from merely Greek monarchs in a foreign land into true pharaohs, divine rulers in a line stretching back to the first dynasties. She had survived the intrigues of Lysimachus's court, endured betrayal by Ptolemy Serranus, and escaped exile by wit alone. She had outlived her enemies and grieved over murdered sons. And now she would rule. The transformation was not merely symbolic. Ptolemy II became Ptolemy Philadelphus, the brother lover. She brought to the throne something Egypt had not seen in centuries, a queen who had not merely been born royal, but forged by fire. Arsinoe threw herself into governance with a fervor that astonished even the seasoned court. But her greatest influence lay in foreign affairs. The Hellenistic world was shifting. Under her guidance, the royal couple began appearing on coinage as gods, not metaphorically, but literally. The policy worked. To their subjects, Greek and Egyptian alike, the Ptolemies were no longer foreign usurpers. Yet for all its triumph, the price of that transformation was steep. Arsinoe had sacrificed everything. Now, in the final act of her life, she wore the double crown of Egypt, wielded power beside a brother 20 years her junior, and stood enshrined in stone as a living goddess. Their marriage produced no children. It did not need to. Ptolemy already had heirs. In the palace at Alexandria, surrounded by colonnades carved with her likeness, Arsinoe Philadelphus must have looked back on the road she had traveled. And yet she had endured. Her dynasty would continue the path she carved. But that story lies ahead. For now, we leave Arsinoe in the moment of her vindication, wreathed in incense, wrapped in linen, worshipped in temples, and feared in courts. She had been made a pawn and made herself a queen. She had been forced into sacred marriage and claimed it as her throne. She had once trembled in a Macedonian palace as her sons were slaughtered. Now she ruled Egypt beside a god. Now she stood as a goddess in the land of the pharaohs, her power uncontested, her legacy secured. She had paid the ultimate price for power, but she had also claimed the ultimate reward, immortality. Not merely in the minds of historians, but in the rituals and beliefs of the people she ruled. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting amber shadows across the palace gardens, Arsinoe must have felt a rare, quiet satisfaction. She had endured the unendurable, overcome impossible odds, and transformed herself from victim to divine queen. The young girl who had once been married off at 15 had become a woman who redefined what it meant to rule as a Ptolemaic monarch. The woman who only wanted to protect her family had laid the foundation for a system that would devour countless others in the centuries that followed. Inside the palace, the divine siblings performed their sacred duties, enacting rituals that sustained the balance of the cosmos. The tradition Arsinoe had founded would endure, but it would never wash clean the blood at its roots. In temples, priests offered incense and prayers for the prosperity of the Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling gods. But all of them would trace their divine identity back to this moment, to this woman, and to the painful transformation that turned a sister and mother into a goddess. Now in her 40s, Arsinoe embraced her role as Queen Pharaoh with tireless determination, as if aware that this was her final chance to etch her name into the bedrock of history. The Seleucid Empire, still staggering from the political chaos that followed Seleucus's assassination, was fracturing under the weight of competing claimants. Antiochus I, the rightful heir, faced rebellion from governors and generals eager to carve out their own kingdoms. She had long learned that survival was not merely about endurance. It was about becoming essential. Across the city, merchants traded, scribes wrote, farmers rested believing themselves, watched over by rulers who had once been mortal. Her bloodline would continue not through her own children, but through the institution she built. Lysimachus had hesitated before eliminating Agathocles, and it had cost him his throne. Serranus had moved too quickly and grown overconfident. His downfall was equally swift. She understood the ambitions of generals, their fears, their pride, their weakness. Cities groaning under Seleucid taxation welcomed the Ptolemaic banners as emblems of liberation. And Arsinoe, never content to rule from afar, joined several of these campaigns, not only to inspire the soldiers, but to ensure that the victories were turned into lasting political capital. And when her brother husband wavered between caution and boldness, it was Arsinoe who offered the decisive voice. Her presence reminded both soldiers and citizens that Egypt was ruled not just by strategy, but by sacred right. A queen who had once fled in fear was now at the heart of empire, shaping its future. What was once considered scandalous marriage between royal siblings would become the foundation of the dynasty's legitimacy. And future queens would look back to Arsinoe as the matriarch who had shown that survival, even in the darkest moments, was possible. But the price had been immense. Antiochus is fractured, his empire bleeds, but wounds heal. Delay and he will gather strength. Move now, while fortune favors us. Every future dynastic marriage would carry an echo of her sacrifice. Every divine right would remember the pain that had birthed tradition. She had preserved the dynasty, yes, but in doing so, she had lost herself. She had ceased to be merely a woman and had become a symbol, a goddess, a myth. The cruel irony was complete. In her effort to protect her humanity, her children, her identity, she had to surrender it. To remain a mother, she became a legend. As night fell over Alexandria, the city settled into the rhythm it would carry for generations. And in the still corners of memory, the laughter of two murdered children echoed faintly through the palace gardens, a soft, tragic reminder of the price power always demands. Her story was far from over. The Ptolemaic dynasty would endure for over 2 more centuries, producing rulers remembered as both brilliant and depraved. The years that followed the divine marriage revealed the delicate balance between power and the toll it exacted. That moment came in 274 BCE, with the outbreak of the First Syrian War. For Egypt, this turmoil was both a threat and an opportunity, a chance to reclaim lands lost under Seleucus, but also the risk of being pulled into a costly and prolonged conflict. Arsinoe's counsel proved invaluable. Her years in the courts of Lysimachus and Ptolemy Ceraunus had taught her how dynasties rose and fell. "Strike now," she urged, standing beside him on the palace balcony, gazing out over Alexandria's harbor as warships prepared to depart. Her advice was not theory. It was born from bitter experience. She had seen the price of hesitation. The lesson was clear. In the Hellenistic world, timing was everything. The war that followed vindicated her. Egyptian armies surged through Palestine and into southern Syria, reclaiming territories long lost. Yet her talents extended beyond the battlefield. Arsinoe had mastered the art of appearing divine without seeming distant. She understood something many of her peers did not: the power of narrative, and how essential it was in shaping both perception and memory of rule. Under her guidance, the royal court of Egypt blossomed into a hub of artistic and literary production, reminiscent of the intellectual vibrancy of Periclean Athens. Poets such as Theocritus were commissioned to compose verses elevating the royal couple to divine status, likening them to Zeus and Hera. These verses were carefully crafted to appeal to Greek sensibilities while justifying what might otherwise be viewed as taboo. She became a prominent patron of the great library of Alexandria, drawing scholars from across the Mediterranean to turn the city into an intellectual beacon of the ancient world. As Zeus, king of the immortals, loves Hera, his sister wife, wrote Theocritus, so does Ptolemy love his bride. The comparison was intentional. If the king of the gods could marry his sister, then surely mortal kings could do the same. Your father and I are but stewards, holding the throne until you are ready. They were hard-earned truths, forged through years of political survival. Arsinoe had watched too many royal children fall into ruin, believing bloodline alone would protect them. Without strength and wisdom, birthright meant nothing. She took part in council meetings, her voice holding the same weight as any general or advisor. She received foreign ambassadors, using her fluency in languages and diplomacy to secure alliances. Monarchs courted her favor, aware of her unmatched influence over Ptolemy II. Scholars dedicated works to her. Poets immortalized her in verse. She even performed rituals once reserved for pharaohs, asserting her presence in the sacred balance between gods and kingdom. Never forget, power is not simply inherited. It is earned decision by decision. The gods may have made you a prince, but only you can make yourself a king. While many held influence behind closed doors, few had formal power or divine status. She redefined what it meant to be a queen in both the Greek and Egyptian worlds. All of them, in some form, would trace their legitimacy back to Arsinoe. What had begun as a tool of oppression became a crown of power. She had taken the chains that bound her and melted them into gold. Later scholars would call it Ptolemaic queenship, a model that merged traditional Egyptian sacred kingship with Hellenistic conceptions of authority and visibility. She had no children of her own to pass down her bloodline, but she had created something more enduring, an institution, a tradition, and a vision of female sovereignty that would outlive her body and her name. The crown prince, who would one day become Ptolemy III, was still a child when Arsinoe became his stepmother. In her final years, she even established a cult in her own name. Temples were built, prayers were offered, and rituals performed, all in honor of a queen still alive, an unprecedented gesture in the ancient world. Instead of treating him as a threat, she embraced him with warmth and political wisdom. In the temples that lined the Nile, she and Ptolemy were portrayed as Osiris and Isis divine siblings, whose sacred union upheld the cosmic balance. Hieroglyphic texts spoke of their marriage in terms steeped in ancient tradition, emphasizing continuity with pharaonic customs rather than foreign innovation. But Arsinoe knew better than to rely solely on Hellenistic ideals. Her influence extended far beyond ceremonial appearances. She restructured the royal household, introducing new rituals and court protocols that highlighted the divine authority of the monarchs. She also funded the construction of grand temples and civic buildings, monuments that announced the strength of the Ptolemaic state to its citizens and to foreign dignitaries alike. One of her most delicate tasks, however, was integrating Ptolemy II's children from his first marriage into the new regime. "You are the future of this dynasty," she once told him during a private audience. These were not empty words. The boy listened. In time, he would become one of the dynasty's most capable rulers. As the years passed, Arsinoe assumed roles that had traditionally belonged only to men. It was a remarkable transformation. The woman once used as a pawn in her father's political games had become a sovereign in her own right, equal in rank to kings across the Mediterranean. Among the people, she was worshipped. Farmers believed their crops flourished because of her divine blessings. Merchants credited her with the prosperity of Alexandria. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was the new standard she set for queenship. Before Arsinoe, royal women in the Hellenistic world were valued mainly for their ability to bear heirs and serve as diplomatic tools. Arsinoe changed that. Future queens, including Cleopatra II and Cleopatra VII, would walk the path she forged. There was irony in her triumph. The very institution sibling marriage that had once been used to entrap her became the foundation of her authority. As she entered her 50s, Arsinoe began to consider her legacy more consciously. The tradition of royal sibling marriage, which began formally with her union to Ptolemy II, would become the hallmark of the Ptolemaic dynasty, distinguishing it from all other Hellenistic realms. Festivals were established to celebrate her divine marriage. Priesthoods were formed to uphold her sacred rites. These were not merely expressions of royal vanity, they were deliberate, strategic efforts to ensure that her innovations would endure beyond her death. That end came in 270 BCE, when Arsinoe was just 46 years old. The cause remains unknown. Perhaps it was illness, perhaps poison, or perhaps the simple toll of a life lived under the relentless pressure of power and survival. But how she died matters less than what she accomplished while alive. She was deified as Arsinoe Philadelphos, the brother-loving goddess, and incorporated into the official religion of Egypt. Temples across the kingdom kept her sacred fires burning. Her image continued to appear on coins and monuments for centuries. Her funeral was a spectacle worthy of a pharaoh. The streets of Alexandria were flooded for days as mourners from across the Mediterranean gathered to pay their respects. Poets recited verses in her honor. Priests conducted ceremonies in multiple languages. And the people of Egypt grieved for their divine queen. Even in death, her influence did not fade. Historians would debate the wisdom and morality of the tradition Arsinoe began. Some saw it as a grotesque distortion of natural law, a symbol of dynastic decay. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and encountered Cleopatra VII, he was struck by her commanding presence, her divine assurance. Others, more sympathetic, recognized it as a brilliant adaptation to the political realities of a fractured and multicultural world. Bereft of his partner and co-ruler, Ptolemy II established a state cult in her honor. She turned exploitation into empowerment, victimhood into sovereignty. But her greatest legacy was the tradition she created. But through intellect, resilience, and ruthless clarity, she became something ancient history had rarely seen. A woman who ruled not through marriage or motherhood alone, but by merit, by design, and by the sheer force of will. Future Ptolemaic rulers followed the precedent she had set, marrying their siblings to reinforce the divine nature of their rule. She had been forced to become a goddess because in her world, to be merely human was not enough to survive. And yet, what she created was no illusion. But she died as a goddess, the architect of a new world order. What had once been a scandalous practice became the defining hallmark of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But through an enduring idea, that queens could be more than symbols, that they could be sovereigns. The line between God and mortal, between taboo and authority, blurred in her name. Each testified to the price she paid and the victory she won. A queen who turned every chain into a crown. A victim who became a goddess. A pawn who became the rulebook. That even incest, the ultimate symbol of exploitation, could, in her hands, become divine. Each generation of royal sibling marriages paid silent tribute to her, a recognition that she alone had discovered the formula for legitimacy in a world governed by power, not principle. The irony was inescapable. She showed that power could emerge from pain, and that divine authority could be born not from myth, but from suffering and ambition. The people of Egypt returned to their homes, carrying the memory of a queen unlike any before her. A reminder that even the most horrific circumstances can be forged into something enduring, meaningful, and powerful. She had been forced into incest by the political calculations of men, but she transformed that same institution into a source of unparalleled female authority. As time passed, the dynasty she had helped to build would eventually collapse under Roman conquest. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came centuries later from an unexpected observer. "How does she carry herself like that?" he reportedly asked an advisor. The answer was simple. She was heir to a tradition crafted by Arsinoe II, a tradition that taught queens how to rule as gods in a man's world. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable part of Arsinoe's story. She began life as a pawn traded, married, and used in the name of diplomacy. The cost had been incalculable. She had sacrificed her youth, her peace, her chance at ordinary love and motherhood. She gave birth not to children, but to an institution, a model of queenship, a legacy that would ripple through centuries of history. She proved that even in the most patriarchal of societies, a woman could seize the symbols of her oppression and reshape them into instruments of rule. As the sun set over the Nile on the day of her funeral, casting long shadows over the temples built in her honor, she had once been the young girl forced into marriage by her father's schemes. The bloodline she had tried to preserve through her own children lived on, not through heirs. Every ritual that glorified royal incest, every coin that bore the image of brother and sister rulers, every temple that enshrined her name, all were monuments to her. In life and in death, Arsenou to Philadelphos remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to accept the limits others placed on her. She had shown the world that even the darkest instruments of control could be transformed into engines of power. Her story ended. But her legacy endured long after the last Ptolemaic pharaoh fell beneath a Roman sword. And even then, her name lived on, in temples, in texts, in memory. She had been the girl no one asked. She became the woman no one could ignore. And in the end, perhaps that was victory enough.